A small diner in rainy Manchester was days from being taken away. The owner had nothing left, no money, no mercy from the world around him. But he still fed every stranger who walked through his door. And one night, the man he fed with his very last bowl of soup arrived in a convoy of black SUVs and silenced an entire street. But before we go any further, if you're someone who believes that doing good still matters in this world, this story was made for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because every week we bring you real, powerful stories about ordinary people who chose kindness when the world told them not to. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's get into it. There's a particular kind of rain that falls on Manchester in late autumn. It doesn't pour. It doesn't storm. It just settles, like a gray blanket pulled over the whole city, slow and suffocating, soaking into everything: the cobblestones, the brick walls, the worn-out souls trying to make it through another week. On one such evening, on a narrow street in the older part of the city, a small diner called the Corner Table sat tucked between a closed-down laundrette and a newsagent with a faded awning. It wasn't much to look at. The sign above the door flickered, half the letters dark, the other half buzzing with the last of their energy. The windows were fogged from the inside, and through them, you could just barely make out the warm amber glow of the lights within. That warmth, that was Edmund Hartley. Edmund was 53 years old, with hands that told the story of a man who had worked every single day of his adult life. Rough palms, a callus on his right thumb from years of gripping a spatula. He wasn't a tall man, wasn't a loud man, but there was something about him, a steadiness, a quiet dignity that made people feel safe the moment they walked through his door. He had run the Corner Table for 11 years. Through recessions, through a pandemic, through the slow death of the high street around him. He had outlasted coffee chains and fancy bistros and trendy pop-ups. Not because he was shrewd. Not because he had investors or a marketing strategy. Because he cared. Every evening, without fail, someone hungry found their way to his door. A young lad with nowhere to sleep. An elderly woman whose pension didn't stretch far enough. A father too proud to ask for help but too desperate not to accept it. Edmund never made it a big moment. He'd simply nod toward a booth, disappear into the kitchen, and return with something warm. No bill. No questions. No judgment. The regulars hated it. He's running a charity, not a business, one man muttered from the corner booth one morning, stirring his tea with a kind of irritation that suggested he'd said it many times before. Soft as butter. Always has been. His companion didn't even look up from his newspaper. He'll be closed by Christmas. Mark my words. Edmund heard every word. He always did. But he kept wiping down the counter, kept his face neutral, kept moving. What was he supposed to say? That he'd tried to be harder? That he'd stood at that door once, years ago, and told a freezing woman there was nothing left, and had never forgiven himself for it? No. Some lessons you learn once. It was on a Tuesday evening, with the rain at its most relentless, that the door opened and a man shuffled in. He was thin, not just slim, but hollowed out, the way a person looks when their body has been living off nothing but cold air and broken sleep for far too long. His coat was at least 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like a curtain. His beard was patchy, his eyes sunken, and his hands, Edmund noticed the hands first, they wouldn't stop trembling. Edmund set down his cloth. Come in, friend. Sit yourself down. The man didn't speak. He moved slowly to the nearest booth and lowered himself into the seat like every joint in his body was protesting. Edmund said nothing more. He went to the kitchen, and with the last of what he had, the very last portions he'd been saving to balance the books, he made a bowl of thick vegetable soup, cut 2 slices of brown bread, and brought it out with a hot mug of tea. He placed it gently on the table. The man looked up at him, and for just a moment, something passed between them, not words, not even a smile. Just a look, long and searching, as if the stranger was reading something written deep behind Edmund's eyes. Edmund nodded once and turned back to the counter. Later that night, after the stranger had gone and the diner was empty and locked, Edmund sat alone in the back office. In front of him was an envelope he'd been avoiding for 3 days. He already knew what was inside. He opened it anyway. Foreclosure proceedings. Outstanding debts. Seizure of property within 7 days unless full payment is received. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it beside the cold cup of tea on his desk. Outside, the rain kept falling, and Edmund Hartley stared at the wall, wondering if, this time, kindness really had cost him everything. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who are waiting for you to fail. Edmund felt it every morning now. He'd unlock the front door of the corner table just before 7, flip the sign from closed to open, and stand for a moment in the doorway, breathing in the cold Manchester air, steadying himself before the day began. And every morning, without fail, he could feel the weight of the street's quiet judgment pressing down on his shoulders like a second coat. The whispers had grown louder. Not dramatically, nobody confronted him directly, nobody had the courage for that. But it was in the looks. The slow shakes of the head from the newsagent next door. The way conversations paused just a half-second too long when he walked past a group of neighbors. The knowing glances exchanged over coffee cups inside his own diner. He's nearly done. Poor fool. Edmund responded the only way he knew how. He kept cooking. By Wednesday, he was working with almost nothing. A bag of lentils. Some wilting carrots. Half a tin of chopped tomatoes he'd found pushed to the very back of the pantry shelf. He stretched every ingredient as far as it would go, quietly, methodically, the way his mother had taught him during harder times in their family kitchen decades ago. Waste nothing. Feed everyone. The rest will follow. He clung to that now like a man holding the last rung of a ladder. The stranger came back. He always came back. Every evening, just as the light outside faded from gray to dark, the door would open and that same thin figure would slip inside. He never announced himself. Never made a fuss. He'd settle into the same booth, third from the window, and wait. And Edmund would bring him whatever there was. Some nights it was soup. Some nights just bread and butter and a boiled egg. The man never complained. He simply ate, slowly and carefully, as if he understood the value of every single mouthful. And he watched Edmund. Constantly. Quietly. With those deep, unreadable eyes that noticed everything. It unsettled Edmund, if he was honest with himself. But not in a threatening way. More like the feeling of being studied by someone who already knew the answer to a question they hadn't yet asked. On Thursday afternoon, a young woman came in with 2 small children. The little ones, a boy and a girl neither older than 6, pressed their faces against the glass of the display counter with the pure, uninhibited wonder that only hungry children have. The woman's eyes told a different story. Tired. Ashamed. On the edge of something she didn't want to name. She asked quietly if she could have 2 children's portions. She counted coins onto the counter as she said it, slowly, carefully, already knowing there weren't enough. Edmund looked at the coins, then at the children, then back at her. "Put those away," he said softly. "Sit down. All 3 of you." He went into the kitchen and used the last of his flour and the last of his butter to make something warm and filling and good. He could hear the children talking excitedly in the booth, their little voices carrying through the quiet diner like something close to music. He stood over the stove, and for just a moment, just one, he let himself cry. Not loudly, just a few quiet tears that he wiped away with the back of his wrist before picking up the plates. He carried the food out with a smile. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay in the small flat above the diner, staring at the ceiling, doing the same arithmetic he'd been doing for weeks, reaching the same impossible answer every time. The numbers didn't lie. The suppliers had stopped delivering. 2 had sent final demand letters. The bank wasn't returning his calls anymore. And the foreclosure notice sat in the office drawer like a countdown timer he couldn't switch off. 7 days. 6. 5. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. Edmund was behind the counter before anyone else was awake, going through the motions, wiping surfaces, arranging the few remaining condiments, boiling water for coffee that fewer and fewer people were coming in to drink. Then the door opened. Not customers. 2 officers in uniform stepped inside, their expressions professionally blank. Behind them, a man in a sharp gray suit clutched a clipboard and let his eyes travel around the diner with the detached efficiency of someone calculating its value in square footage. "Mr. Hartley?" Edmund set down his cloth. "That's me." The words that followed were precise and procedural and utterly devastating. Repossession order. End of business day. Vacate the premises. The diner, his 11 years, his mother's advice, his every early morning and late night, would be seized before sunset. The few customers in the booths had gone completely still. Edmund could feel their eyes on his back. And then, from somewhere near the window, a voice, low but perfectly audible. "Told you kindness doesn't pay." Edmund gripped the edge of the counter. His knuckles went white. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, absorbing it. The verdict the street had already reached long before today. And then the sound of tires on wet cobblestone. Slow, deliberate. Edmund looked up toward the window and felt the air in the room change before he could even understand why. Outside, one by one, a line of black SUVs rolled to a stop along the narrow street. Engines idling. Windows dark. Every head in the diner turned. The officers near the door exchanged a glance. And then the lead door opened. The whole street held its breath. That's the only way to describe it. The conversations that had been buzzing just moments before, the whispers, the quiet mockery, the satisfied murmuring of people watching a man lose everything. All of it stopped. Completely. As if someone had reached into the air and turned down the volume on the entire world. The man who stepped out of that lead SUV was not the man anyone in that diner expected to see. He was tall, composed, dressed in a suit so precisely tailored it seemed almost architectural. Dark navy, not a crease out of place, a white shirt beneath it crisp as fresh paper. His beard, once patchy and wild, was now neatly trimmed close to the jaw. His shoes clicked against the wet Manchester cobblestones with quiet authority. And behind him, 2 assistants followed in step, carrying leather briefcases and thick folders pressed to their chests. He walked like a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry. Edmund stared. Something pulled at the back of his memory. Something in the shape of the eyes, the particular stillness of the man's expression. And then it landed, like a stone dropped into still water. The booth. Third from the window. The trembling hands around a mug of tea. It was him. The diner was so quiet you could hear the rain still dripping from the sign outside. The officers near the door stepped back instinctively. Not out of fear, but out of the involuntary respect that certain presences command without asking for it. The man in the suit walked past them without acknowledgement. His gaze was fixed, with absolute steadiness, on Edmund. He stopped at the counter. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Edmund's chest rose and fell. His hands, which had been gripping the counter edge, slowly released. The folder the assistant placed on the counter between them landed with a soft, definitive sound, like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The man's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, but it filled every corner of the room. "Mr. Hartley, my name is Callum Voss." A ripple moved through the diner. A few sharp intakes of breath from the booths. The kind that told Edmund that name meant something to people even if it meant nothing to him yet. "This folder contains the title deeds to this building," Callum continued. "Every outstanding debt against the corner table has been cleared as of this morning. The diner is yours. Fully. Permanently. No conditions." Edmund opened his mouth. Closed it again. I don't understand," he finally managed. "Why would you?" "Because of what you did," Callum said simply. He didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he let the silence hold the room for just a moment longer. The way a person does when they want what comes next to land properly, to be truly heard. "I came in here with nothing. Or at least I looked like nothing. And you didn't see a problem to solve or a burden to assess. You just saw a person. You gave me your last bowl of soup, Mr. Hartley. I know it was your last because I'd been watching this place for 2 weeks before I walked through that door." Another ripple. Louder this time. "I am what they call an impact investor," Callum continued, his tone unhurried. "Before I put money into a community, I need to understand what that community is built on. Not the buildings. Not the business rates or the footfall statistics. The people. Specifically, whether the people with the least are still willing to give." He glanced around the room then. Briefly. Taking in the faces in the booths, the neighbors, the regulars, the same people who had spent weeks shaking their heads and muttering their predictions. Some of them couldn't hold his gaze. "You passed," Callum said, turning back to Edmund. "More than passed. In 11 years of doing this across 7 countries, I have never seen what I saw in this diner. Not once." Edmund pressed his palm flat against the folder on the counter. The paper was cool beneath his hand. Real. Solid. He needed that. Needed to feel that this wasn't something his exhausted mind had constructed from hope and desperation. "There's more," Callum said. He nodded to his assistant, who opened a second folder. "I want to fund expansion. 3 new locations across the north of England, fully staffed, fully equipped. The same model you've built here. Good food, open doors, no one turned away. I'll back every penny of it. All I ask is that you run it the way you've always run this place." Edmund's throat tightened. It wasn't the money that broke him. It wasn't the deeds or the cleared debts or the promise of something larger than he'd ever dared to imagine for himself. It was the word always. The idea that the thing everyone had told him was his greatest flaw, his stubbornness, his softness, his inability to close the door on a hungry stranger, was in fact the most valuable thing about him. His eyes filled. He didn't try to stop it this time. From the booths, the silence had transformed into something different now. No longer the silence of a crowd watching someone fail. This was the silence of people reckoning with themselves. The man from the corner booth, the one who had said kindness doesn't pay not 20 minutes ago, stared at the table in front of him, jaw tight, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. Edmund picked up the pen the assistant offered him. His hand was steady, now steadier than it had been in months. He signed his name where Callum indicated, slowly and deliberately, the way you sign something you intend to honor for the rest of your life. Callum extended his hand. Edmund took it. The next morning, the corner table opened at 7 o'clock, same as always. The flickering sign above the door still buzzed. Edmund hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to. It felt like part of the place now, like a scar that had become something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out onto the cobblestones. The booths filled slowly, the way they always did. A few regulars, a mother with a pushchair, an old man in a flat cap who came every Friday without fail. Edmund moved behind the counter with the same unhurried rhythm. Wiping down, refilling, checking the clock. And just before 7:30, the door opened. A young man stepped inside. Thin coat, uncertain eyes, the particular look of someone who isn't sure they're allowed to be somewhere. Edmund looked up. He nodded toward the third booth from the window. "Sit down, friend," he said quietly. "I'll get you something warm." Outside, the Manchester rain had returned, soft and gray and settling. But inside the corner table, the light held steady. And it would keep holding. Because that's the thing about genuine kindness, the real, stubborn, costly kind that people mistake for weakness. It doesn't just survive. It builds. And here's what I want you to sit with tonight. Edmund Hartley didn't do anything extraordinary. He didn't climb mountains or make headlines or change the world in any way the world would have noticed. He just kept the door open. He kept the stove on. He kept showing up for people that everyone else had already decided weren't worth showing up for. And they called him foolish for it. They laughed at him for it. They watched him, almost with satisfaction, as everything he'd built slowly began to crumble around him. Because that's what the world does sometimes. It looks at a generous heart and calls it a weakness. It looks at a man who gives and assumes he simply doesn't know any better. But here's what the world gets wrong every single time. Kindness is not weakness. It never was. It is perhaps the most disciplined, the most courageous, the most quietly powerful force a human being can choose to carry, especially when it costs them something, especially when nobody is clapping, especially when the bills are piling up and the suppliers have stopped calling back and the neighbors are already writing your ending for you. To be kind then, in that moment, in that silence, when everything in you is exhausted and afraid, that is not softness. That is strength in its purest, most undefeated form. And what Callum Voss understood, what he had spent years and crossed borders trying to find, was that the rarest thing in this world isn't talent. It isn't ambition. It isn't even intelligence. It's a person who remains good when goodness offers them nothing in return. A person who feeds the stranger even when their own cupboards are bare. A person who holds the door open not because they expect a reward, but because somewhere deep in their bones, they simply cannot bring themselves to close it. Those people exist. They are rarer than we admit, and they are holding more of this world together than we will ever fully know. So tonight, I want to ask you something. And I mean this sincerely, not as a closing line, not as content, but as a genuine question worth sitting with before you sleep. When was the last time you were kind when it cost you something? Not the easy kindness. Not the kindness that comes when you have plenty and it asks nothing of you. But the hard kind. The kind that required you to give when you weren't sure you had enough left. The kind that asked you to see someone, really see them, at a moment when the rest of the world had already looked away. Because that kind of kindness doesn't just change the person who receives it. It changes you. It marks you. It quietly, permanently reshapes the kind of human being you are becoming. And you may never know, you will almost certainly never know, what ripple that single moment of grace sent out into the world. Whose life it steadied, whose despair it interrupted, whose faith in people it quietly, unexpectedly restored. Edmund didn't know. He couldn't have known. He was just a tired man behind a counter in a flickering diner on a rainy Manchester street, doing the only thing that felt right, even when everything around him suggested it wasn't. And that is precisely why it changed everything. So whatever you're carrying right now, whatever pressure, whatever scarcity, whatever fear is sitting heavy on your chest tonight, don't let it close you. Don't let it make you smaller than you are. Don't let it convince you that you have nothing left to give, because the truth is, the most powerful thing you can offer this world has never been money or status or influence. It has always, always been the way you make another person feel seen. Keep the door open. Keep the stove on. Keep showing up. And trust that the rest, in ways you cannot yet imagine, in timing you cannot yet predict, will follow. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the way you treat people when no one is watching still matters deeply, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.